One Israel Fund, beating to the rhythm of the heartland, enhancing and securing daily life in the Jewish communities of Judea and Samaria for over 25 years. Join us and make a difference. Hello, everyone. Eve Harow, Director of Community Development and Tourism for One Israel Fund. I want to welcome you to the newest in our series of webinars that we have been running since, I guess, in theme with tonight's lecture. A plague of biblical proportions hit the world, and many of you have not been able to come to Israel. So we've been trying to bring Israel to you via webinars, politicians, journalists, experts on Judea and Samaria, which is, of course, One Israel Fund's niche, but also about Israel and the region. For those of you who are not familiar with the fund, we are the premier organization for close to 30 years now, supporting the Jews who live in Yehuda v'Shomron, Judea and Samaria, the ones who used to live in Gaza, and now, of course, the Gaza envelope. Our last virtual video, which we've been putting out about one a month, going into the communities, seeing people, talking to people. So the last one that we just put out last week, if you haven't seen it yet, on Netiva Asara, the community just north of the Gaza Strip, and the really, like you can't even make these people up, the people that live there. Really, they inspire me, they'll inspire you. And that's what we do here. We build parks, we do a lot of security, and we just want to make life as normal as possible for the Jews who live in the wonderful communities in Yehuda v'Shomron. We are actually starting to run a mission now that hopefully Israel is going to be opening up a little bit. We're running a mission at the beginning of November. If you're interested, you can be in touch with the office. And I hope, as Director of Tourism, that pretty soon I'll be taking buses out. And those of you who are coming to Israel, be on our mailing list. You can see when the buses are going out. We'll take you to places that you've probably never been. And really, our trips can be totally life-changing. So get involved and keep in touch with us. And we're just happy to see you here tonight. And I, in particular, am really excited about tonight's guest, Rabbi Dr. Joshua Berman, professor of Tanakh at Bar-Ilan University, one of the too few people in the world who can deal with biblical criticism because he knows it from the academic side, and also, of course, has smicha. He's a rabbi, went to Har Etzion Yeshiva. So he has put out books, including Ani Ma'amin. I interviewed him when the book came out about a year and a half ago, I believe. And just a fascinating, I'm sure you'll enjoy tonight's lecture, which is going to be about Egypt, the Tanakh and Egypt. And he's running a trip at the end of January to Egypt. I think it's possibly the first time that there's a kosher and Shabbat-oriented trip to Egypt. I think I was possibly the first person to sign up for it. And as I just found out, it's sold out. So, but we're going to hear some of what we're going to be hearing in January. Rabbi Berman, thank you so much for joining us here tonight on One Israel Fund's webinar.
Okay, thank you, Eve, and good evening to all of our viewers and listeners.
All right, by the way, for those of you who don't know where you are and what day it is, which is a lot of us, it is October 18th, 2021. And in Israel, where we're broadcasting from, it's already the 13th day of Cheshvan, 5782. Okay, so Rabbi Berman, tell us a little bit about, like, how did you become, I mean, we all would like to think as people who know the Bible, we all kind of know Egypt, right? We spent a lot of time there. A lot of the biblical stories are in Egypt. What makes your expertise with Egypt so unique?
So obviously, you know, we sit at the Seder table every year and we read the stories in Chumash. Mitzrayim, Egypt is always on our mind. It is without doubt the most mentioned location in the Tanakh outside of the locations of the land of Israel itself. And so we have this kind of image informed by our biblical texts. But I'm coming from a totally different place. What I am trying to get in touch with, together with colleagues of mine across the pond, many of them conservative Christian scholars, is to understand the realia, the deep connection between the Tanakh and particularly the Torah and particularly Sefer Shemot, the book of Exodus, and what we see when we visit Egypt, when we unearth the archaeological findings there, when we read the inscriptions and the papyri, and suddenly things burst into 3 dimensions and full color. Things that we read in Chumash that we thought we understood, and now, whoa, the reality just comes alive.
Wow. So, I mean, when we talk about Egypt today is very different than the Egypt that was, right? The Egyptian civilization that the Tanakh goes into, we're not going to see those Egyptians anymore, right? There's going to be no one walking sideways when we're in Egypt.
Well,
How does that work?
You'll see some mummies, that's for sure. But
Okay.
most importantly, let me if I can just bring up my PowerPoint presentation.
Please.
This will let me see if this will work. We go from here.
I'm so happy when I do webinars and not just my podcast every week, because then we can have the visual.
Here. I want us to look at, just have a look at this one picture. You can see it well, Eve?
No, I don't see any. I see you.
Oh, you see me. I see.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And 1 minute. Let's try this again. One moment. Sorry about that. I think there, that, and that.
Yeah, there we go.
You should see, yeah, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, excellent. Yeah. So this is I took this last January when I was on a tour that I'll speak about soon. But that's what you can see already tells us what's so special about touring around in Egypt. See, when we're touring around, the wonderful places in Eretz Yisrael, largely what we're looking at is the topography and the places themselves. Right. Structures, not so much. And pictures and inscriptions, zero, like almost nothing at all. You go to Rome or Greece, you have big buildings, but you don't have what you see in front of you here. Endless inscriptions, endless pictures, perfectly preserved because there's no moisture and because Egypt is surrounded by desert on 3 sides and the Mediterranean on a 4th. It means that very few conquering armies came in and tore everything down. And so when you have a guide who can show you what's going on, as in the things that you see in front of you now, it's endless what you have access to. So you might not see, Egyptians from the time of the Exodus walking around, but you will see the pictures that they drew and you will read the inscriptions that they wrote, and they are endless and perfectly preserved.
So how do you connect this, what we're looking at here, for example, to the Tanakh? It's in terms of the context of the time of the Tanakh, or are there hints to what we read or our story that we can find? Yeah, endlessly, endless. Look, let me give one little tidbit, okay? That everybody here is going to hear this now, and I promise you will remember what I'm about to say until Seder table, and you will say it at your Seder table, okay? All right. We all know that at the Seder table, we read, and it's based on verses in the Torah, that Hashem took us out of Egypt b'yad chazaka u'bizroa netuya, with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. And I guess most of us just assume that that's kind of a metaphor for the Almighty's might, and it's coming to say that it was, it was done with power and it was miraculous. Now, what's interesting about those words, Yad Chazaka B'Zroa Netuya, a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, is that you might have expected that throughout the Tanakh, whenever the Almighty does a miracle, that Scripture would say, and there goes the Almighty with his mighty hand and his outstretched arm. But that's not the case. Sometimes you have the Yad Hagdolah or Yad Hashem, the hand of God. But that phrase, mighty hand and outstretched arm, you don't really find that anywhere other than with reference to the events of the Exodus. And there's good reason for that. And those good reasons you only discover when you go to places like what you see on the screen. Because during what's called the Egyptian New Kingdom, that's when ancient Egypt was at its zenith, which also happens to be the period of the servitude in Egypt, of the Jews in Egypt. What we find is that all of the inscriptions that describe the acts of the pharaohs of that period,
They all routinely use this phrase, mighty hand and outstretched arm. The Pharaoh went and he bashed the Libyans with his mighty hand and his outstretched arm. The Pharaoh one day went on a hunting expedition and bagged 120 elephants. There's an inscription like that, with his mighty hand. One day the Pharaoh was walking and he came across a diamond the size of a fist of the hand, and he picked it up with his outstretched arm. And all of this, this is a trope that these inscriptions use to describe the Pharaoh. And what the Torah is doing is what's called cultural appropriation. It's where you steal the thunder of the oppressor in order to fight cultural resistance. And this is what the Torah is doing. It's saying, you think you have a mighty hand and an outstretched arm? Ha! Watch what the God of Israel does against the Pharaoh with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. So that's, I think, a beautiful idea. And you only get that when you understand the ancient Egyptian context in which the Torah is written.
Wow. So we've got a question from one of our many viewers tonight, which is, outside of the book of Exodus, is there proof that this story happened? And it's not just biblical critics who will say, well, the Jewish people, it got a little crowded on the coast. We were just one of the groups of Canaanites, and it was a little crowded on the coast, so we moved into the hills. And the whole story of Egypt really never happened. And of course, Sinai never happened, and none of that ever happened. So how do we know, those of us who read the Tanakh and take it literally, that this is the story? That's one aspect. But do we know, and does going to Egypt itself in some way illuminate, or I don't want to use the word prove, because it's very hard to prove something that happened so long ago, but how does it add to our understanding of that time period and what might have actually happened?
Sure, I think that there is ample evidence for the Exodus. Maybe not in every detail, maybe not, evidence of seas splitting, but certainly of Israelite presence in Egypt at this time and of coming out. There's ample evidence. And here's how it works. You see, all the critics that say, well, there's no proof, what they're doing is, and it's legitimate, I don't think it's necessarily with an axe to grind or anti-Semitic or atheistic. They will say, well, look, the Torah tells us about Hebrews. We look in everything we know about Egyptian inscriptions, no Hebrews. We look what they say about Israelites, no Israelites. We look about Moses, no Moses. We look about slaves upping and outing. No, there's no mention of that. And obviously there's no mention of the plague. So case closed. Okay. What I say, what my colleagues say, is we need to invert the way in which we work. Rather than looking for what the Torah says in Egypt, let's look about what we know about Egypt in the Torah. And that's where the catch is. Because what we find is that the Torah, using the same principle of cultural appropriation that I mentioned before, of polemicizing, of fighting back, of out-pharaohing the Pharaoh with his own thunder, we see this on a grand scale, particularly with one particularly important inscription from no less than Ramses the Great, who was the greatest pharaoh of the greatest period, the New Kingdom, which I mentioned before, in Egypt. And I have a bunch of slides that I can show about that. Please. If you want me to move to that.
Yeah,
okay,
absolutely.
Great.
Absolutely.
All right.
So what you're saying is that whoever wrote the Bible, let's leave that for a second, knew Egypt.
Yes, intimately. Intimately in a way that you could only know if you were living in the 13th century BCE in Egypt itself. Okay. Now let me just say that a lot of what we're going to be discussing here, this is from my book, which you graciously hosted me the last time we spoke. Ani Ma'amin, Biblical Criticism, Historical Truth, and the 13 Principles of Faith, Magid, 2020. Okay, so, all right. It all starts with the inscription that is really key here is an inscription by Ramses II, Ramses the Great. Let me just say that it's called the Kadesh inscriptions. Let me explain what this is. Okay, so here we have a map of the region, okay? And you can see on the bottom left, we have Egypt in kind of skin tone color. At least that's what it is on my screen. And we have Canaan also in that color because during the New Kingdom, Canaan was under Egyptian influence. In fact, the term Canaan, is an Egyptian term. In fact, the Torah's borders for Canaan, when it talks about you will enter into Eretz Canaan, and here are the borders of the land, are the borders of the Egyptian province of Canaan. Okay, it's like if you were outlining, what is Romania, and you had, Austria's view and Hungary's view, and okay, this is the Egyptian view. That's part of the Egyptian context of all this. Now, to the north of Canaan, which here will include Lebanon and part of Syria, you have the Hittite Empire, the white area in modern day Turkey. Okay, during the time of Ramses the Great, the two superpowers, if you will, in the region were Egypt in the south and the Hittite Empire in the north, and they jockeyed for control in the areas in the middle, and they had a huge battle where it says Orontes River, which is on the Syrian coast today, where scholars believe was the greatest chariot battle of all time, thousands of chariots on each side. Okay, and in fact, we have inscriptions about this battle, both from the Egyptian side and from the Hittite side. Now, what's so important about this battle is not really what happened. We don't really know, and it's so interesting. You go there today, you can't find anything, right?
Really?
This highlights that old maxim: absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Right. And so
absence of proof is not proof of absence.
Right. Thank you.
Same idea.
In other words, when you have the Egyptians saying, "Yep, we had a big battle there," and the Hittites saying, "Yep, we had a big battle there," and you go there, and we know exactly where it is, and you can't find a thing. Well, that just tells you not everything gets preserved. Okay. Now, what's important here is that when Ramses comes home, right, he goes back down south to Egypt. He makes this battle of Kadesh. That's on the Orontes River here. It's not Kadesh that we have in Chumash, Kadesh Barnea, which is in Sinai. Is a popular name for places. Kadesh is a little town here on the Orontes River. Ramses goes home, and he makes the Battle of Kadesh the single most publicized event in all of ancient history, Greece and Rome included. What do I mean by that? Here, look, many of us have been to the Arch of Titus in Rome, okay? There's one Arch of Titus, okay? When Ramses goes back to Egypt, we know today of at least 10 different places where he put up inscriptions and pictures of this Battle of Kadesh, okay? So the fact that it's done in so many places that we know of, let alone all the places that are no longer with us in Egypt, makes it the most publicized event of ancient history. Now,
can we assume that he won, or he wanted people to think he won, or it doesn't matter?
Well, okay, it depends who you ask. The Hittites don't think he won. The Egyptians are certain that he won. Some things don't change.
Today, right?
Exactly. You asked, you said you started at the outset, Eve, how different things must have been back then. In some ways, yes. And in some ways
no.
Okay, good. Now, at these different sites, which you and I will be visiting, God, when we go in January, we see that Ramses puts up both prose and poetry inscriptions about it, and also bas reliefs, like little cartoons. Okay.
Now this is in hieroglyphics. Excuse the maybe stupid question.
But this is, I mean, yes, you have hieroglyphics here on the right side of the picture, but mostly it's a picture that anybody can see. And the reason they made these pictures is probably for the masses who didn't know hieroglyphics, but they still wanted to teach them lessons, kind of like, if you will, in churches in the Middle Ages where they had stained glass windows, so people couldn't read their biblical text, so they looked up and they learned whatever they needed to learn from the images in the stained glass windows. Now, scholars in the 1930s noticed the following thing. They noticed that at a bunch of these sites, we see a depiction of Ramses' camp at Kadesh. This is in a place called the Luxor Temple, which we'll talk about soon. And you can see there's a wall that goes around. Can you see my cursor as it moves?
Yeah.
Okay, great. There's a wall that goes around, and in the middle of the camp, right, you have here troops, and they're kind of camped out. You have this structure here. Okay,
Ooh.
this is Ramses' throne tent. Okay, and what scholars noted is that it has two chambers, a bigger one, which has the dimensions of 2 by 1, and a smaller one that has the dimensions of 1 by 1. Okay, this would be like the outer chamber, and this would be where Ramses would kind of hold camp, okay, or hold forth in the camp. Here's another site, another temple. Also here again, you see the wall that goes around the camp, and you see in the middle, this is Ramses' throne tent, two chambers, one that is 2 by 1 and one that is 1 by 1. Okay.
Perfectly.
And here's yet another site that we're going to be visiting. Same thing. You have the wall that goes around. Okay. And then you have Ramses' throne tent here. Here you have people bowing down in obedience to him in the outer chamber, 2 by 1, and the inner chamber. I'm gonna blow this up for you in a second. 1 by 1. Okay. Now, what's so important about this is how similar this is to.
This is starting to look familiar.
The Mishkan. Okay. The Mishkan has a fence around it. Okay. And of course, in the middle, the king's throne tent, if you will, Hashem, God's
being
tent.
Hashem.
Okay, that's right. With two chambers, one which is 2 by 1, and one which is 1 by 1. Okay, and of course, the Mishkan, the tabernacle, is itself a military encampment. That is, in the book of Numbers, after all this is built up, the children of Israel become a military force with tribes all around, just like Ramses' throne tent had his troops all around. And so what scholars concluded is that there is a remarkable similarity between the throne tent and the camp of Ramses II at the Battle of Kadesh, and in the tabernacle, the Mishkan as well, with what we call the Kodesh, the larger, the 2 by 1 chamber, and the inner chamber, the Holy of Holies, the Kodesh Kodashim, which has dimensions of 1 by 1. And both the entrances from the east. In Egyptian maps, the east is on the left. I'm not sure why, maybe because the Nile flows northward, but it's just the way that it is. Okay. Now, what's so important about this is that not only is there a similarity, you see, similarity between two things when you're doing scholarship is not enough. You need to show that this is singular. In other words, let me put it this way. If there are many other, let's say, shrines, temples in the ancient Near East that have fences around them, that have two chambers with these dimensions, then this parallel is meaningless. But the fact of the matter is that we know of no other structures that look like the Mishkan from the ancient world other than Ramses' camp that looks like this. And there are no other throne camps that we know about in the ancient Near East that have these dimensions here. Before, I'm going to blow up now this image here. This is the throne tent of Ramses at the temple in Abu Simbel, which is on the Sudanese border. And this is what it looks like. Okay. Now here you have 2 by 1, and here you have 1 by 1. But now watch what's happening here in the middle. Do you see this? These are Horus falcons. They have their wings stretched out. And in the middle is what's called, just let me get my cursor back, a cartouche. That means a seal that has the name of Ramses on it. In other words, they're not going to draw Ramses in tiny little proportions. So they have a seal that says on it Ramses. So you have these Horus falcons, or falcons that represent the Egyptian deity Horus, and they are spreading their wings over Ramses. And of course, in the Mishkan, right? In the Mishkan, so we have, exactly. You can't see it's kind of small here, but yes, you have the throne of Hashem, as it were, of the Almighty, and you have the Kruvim, the cherubs, who are spreading their wings, kind of as a place where the divine presence dwells in the middle. it's that close. It's really that close. And the theory already from the 1930s is that none of this is by accident, and that what the Torah is doing here is a grand exercise in what I labeled before cultural appropriation. That is, for the Israelites who are coming out, but at least by the Torah's account, they can't really see him. Sometimes they maybe can see miracles. They can't see him. They can't really hear him. And so there is a need to concretize. So how can we relate to this deity? And the answer is, well, think about the greatest act of the greatest king of the greatest period in Egyptian history, the victory of Ramses the Great over the Hittites at the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BCE, and all of the big monuments that he puts up all over the place, and to then say, ha, we are turning that on Ramses, and now using that to help us concretize our notion of Melech Malchei HaMelachim, the king
the
of
ultimate king. So two things pop into mind.
Yeah.
One is, so it looks like the Israelites, they're leaving Egypt. And like you just said, this is like the best expression of the most amazing king that they can do. However, I could see other people saying, but in the Tanakh, isn't this unique? Like what you're saying is that the tabernacle, which ends up in Shiloh for a certain number of years, and then turns into the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, I mean, it's built along the same lines, is not something unique to the Jewish people, if you will, but it's a copy of something Egyptian. So doesn't that minimize, I could see some people saying this, doesn't this minimize God's special connection to the Jews and the Torah, and the fact that we're starting something new with this whole idea of monotheism and a God that you can't see, there's just some kind of representation, but that's not actually the God himself? Is that something that people have brought up to you?
Sure. Listen. A lot of very good Jews and good Christians, for that matter, have an appropriate, pristine view of Scripture. That Scripture is God's word, and therefore perfect, and therefore kind of unconnected to our world, and unique.
Right.
Unique in its expression, unique in the way it's written.
It was written before the world was even created. So then what happened?
And therefore incomparable to any other piece of literature. Okay, that's a view that's out there. Now let me tell you Maimonides' view. Okay, the Rambam. Maimonides, in the Guide to the Perplexed, in the third section of that great work, he engages in a discussion of each of the mitzvot, each of the commandments, and finding the reasons for it. And time after time, especially with regard to things having to do with cultic worship, sacrifices, tabernacle, temple, etc., the way in which Maimonides rationalizes, explains, finds the meaning of the various laws that we have in those realms is with reference to ancient worship, ancient custom. He does this time and time again. And in fact, Maimonides says in the end of the Guide to the Perplexed, oh, if only I had more access to the ancient Near East, then I would understand the Torah even better. Okay,
wow.
Which is to say,
and he lived in Egypt. And he lived in Egypt.
Well, he did live in Egypt, but he didn't know any of this. This was all
this was all under his nose, but he didn't know.
Yeah,
wow.
Well, yeah, and under his feet, because it was all covered by sand. Yeah, this is that same image that I had before. This is an actual photograph from within that temple itself. Now, the Rambam certainly did not feel, oh my gosh, you mean the Torah is just the Mishkan, the tabernacle is just a knockoff? No, the answer, what Maimonides says time after time, when he makes this move of comparing things in the Torah to what existed beforehand, always it's that what the Torah is doing is adopting and adapting. It is taking what was familiar to the slaves when they came out of Egypt and then tweaking it to make it one step better, to bring them one step closer to the higher levels of abstraction, which of course Maimonides was a great champion of. And so all the things that I have, all the things that I see are exactly in that vein as well. Okay.
So let me ask you something about the years, because this is where things also get a little interesting. You said 13th century, which is the minus 1200s. All right. But if we're already talking about the Mishkan, so we start, it's unclear when did the Exodus happen. If our sources say that the Mishkan, the tabernacle, stood in Shiloh for 369 years, and more or less in minus 1,000, we have David and Jerusalem. You don't fit 369 years in from minus 1250, let's say, into 1,000. So
Right.
how does all this, how do we figure this out?
Yeah, right. So sorting out the years can be a thorny process if you assume that all of the references to years in the Torah and in the Tanakh are literal and quantitative and statistic. It's clear that when you add up, for example, all of the years that are mentioned in the book of Judges, that the period of time you have there is too long. It can't fit all those people. So maybe some of it is overlapping.
Right.
What is important here to understand is that very often in the Tanakh, numbers, especially large ones, are demonstrably serving non-literary means. Okay.
Okay. Can you give us an example?
Well, sure. Okay. I'll tell you something because I have good source for it religiously.
Okay.
And that is a comment made by the Netziv. That's Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, one of the greatest sages of Lithuania in the 19th century, who wrote a commentary on the Chumash, on the Torah, called He'amek Davar. And he makes the following comment. When the Torah says in Genesis 46 that Jacob went down to Egypt with 70 souls, okay? And not only does the Torah say that there were 70, it then gives a roll call of 70 names, 69 names maybe. He's the 70th. But you have seemingly cross validation there, the number of 70 and then 69 names. Okay. So what's left to discuss about how many went down? And then Netziv says there were not 70, there were more. Why does he say this? He says this because he says in the verses prior, it says that Jacob went down with his sons and his daughters and his daughters-in-law and his granddaughters and his grandsons. And when you look at that list of 69 names, there are only 2 that are women.
Right.
And, you say, wow, those girls, they had great marriage possibilities, if there's
Really?
67 and 2, the lucky girls. So he says, well, it must be then that these numbers are non-literal. And he gives a number of accountings of what the significance might be. In my book that I referenced before, I have other ways of looking at that number 70. Or I'll just give you another example. I have another PowerPoint, but I can say this orally. It's really, really easy to grasp and super cool. I have a colleague at Bar-Ilan University named Dr. Neria Klein, and he studied numbers in the Book of Chronicles. Okay, what's important about that is that the numbers are astronomical. I mean, armies are enormous, and the numbers are thrown around, and they're not round numbers. And what you find is that the very largest set of armies is by Jehoshaphat, and he had a total of 1,160,000 soldiers. You look at that number, 1,160,000. You say, if it said he had 1 million soldiers, okay, I feel like $1 million. $1 million.
Yeah.
But to say 1,160,000, that sounds like they're really counting something, no? And what he shows is that when you look in the chapters before, he was a good king. And he had exactly twice the number of soldiers that his father, who was not as good a king, and his father had exactly the sum total of the kings that preceded him. That can't be by accident. This is the Tanakh's way of giving grades. Who is a good king? Who is a better king? And so we see that in a lot of places, the Tanakh is using the numbers not to give us statistics, because really, who cares, but to give us meaning and message. And I believe that is the case with the numbers of the Exodus as well, actually.
Really? In what sense?
Okay, if we say that there were, the Torah says that 600,000 men came out of Egypt, which then, that's just the men of fighting age, right? When you take women, children, elderly, then we're up to easily 2 to 3 million people, okay? And yet there are so many things that don't fit with that. So, for example, when you see the number of firstborn in the Torah, then it would turn out if the number of firstborn that are mentioned, then that would mean that every woman was giving birth to about 60 people. And the Torah never really seems to make that claim. What you find is that the Torah says that when they crossed the Red Sea, they arrived at a place called Elima, and there the children of Israel had 70 date trees and 12 springs. Maybe the springs were huge, but we know how large date trees are. Each date tree fed 30,000 people. That can't be. Or consider the number of priests that were in the time of the desert, right? Priests are descendants of Aaron, okay? He had 4 sons. Maybe there were a total of 20, 25 priests in the desert. Well, when you look at all of the sacrifices that the book of Leviticus mandates from the Jewish people at that time, I mean, how could 3 million people be served by just 25 priests? Or when you see that the Torah says in 2 places, it says it in Deuteronomy and in Exodus, you are the smallest of peoples. We are the smallest of peoples? Really? That means that in the land of Israel, there were 30 million people here? Right. Or when in Exodus 23 says, I'm bringing you into the land and you will conquer it bit by bit because you're too small to take over the whole thing right now. Really? 3 million people is too small? No, it's not. So we have many counterproofs within the Torah itself that seem to suggest that the number is not in the millions. And I believe that this is because there's significance to the numbers. The numbers of each tribe, I think, have significance. That's in the book. We can leave that for another time. Okay, right. But none of that has to do so much with what we see in ancient Egypt. Here, I'll just give some other things. Let me give some other examples of things that we're all very familiar with that suddenly burst into color from a black and white drawing. So this image, okay, is all over Egypt. This is a typical, I would say, the kind of classic pose of a pharaoh. Here you have the pharaoh, okay, and he's got a mace, all right, in his right hand, and he's about to swing it around and shatter the heads of enemy prisoners, okay? And you see this for 3,000 years of pictures in Egypt, you see this. This is kind of pictures that I'm sure paintings, we've all seen paintings from, let's say, the early modern age in Europe, where there's a king on a horse and the horse rears its front hoofs. You know, when I say that, you've seen it because every king posed like that, right? So in ancient Egypt, this was the pose. Okay, now, again, what do we have here? Right hand, it's always the right hand, bearing a mace, about to shatter the heads of the enemies. Okay, in Shirat Hayam, the Song of the Sea, when we say Yemincha Hashem tir'atz oyev, your right hand shatters the enemy, it's playing off of this image. And it's only in Egypt, because everywhere else in the ancient Near East, the right hand holds things, but you never see the phrase shattering. It's only in pictures like this. So it comes alive. And the accounts that Ramses had of that battle of Kadesh that I mentioned before, we looked at the pictures. I then looked at the actual account of the battle, and it follows stage by stage exactly what we find in Exodus 14 and 15, the fleeing from the Egyptians, the chariots chasing after them, the defeat of those chariots, and then a song of praise, the Song of the Sea. And line by line, there are similarities with the song that Ramses' soldiers sing to him. And it's all this cultural appropriation. It's all turning Ramses on his head. And there's no way that anyone could have had access to this outside of the 13th century BCE in Egypt. And therefore, this, to my mind, is the strongest proof that Bnei Israel, the children of Israel, were in Egypt. They experienced something that they understood as liberation from Ramses II, and they attributed this to the Almighty. Okay?
That's wild. But the problem that we have over 3,000 years later is that we don't know the context of ancient Egypt, right? I mean, the Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, as we were written with that context in mind. What you're saying is anybody reading them would get the connection.
That's right.
And get, my God is more powerful than the most powerful king in the entire world.
Right.
But here we are so much later and still reading this book, and not, of course, not just the Jews reading this book. I mean, the Bible is a holy book for so many people around the world.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe this is too much to ask, but what, along the way, all the sages and the prophets, and of course we have Nach, we have the Nevi, we have the editions that were written for hundreds of years afterwards. They still saw what you're mentioning now, like they still had enough of a glimmer, because nobody says, listen, guys, put on your Egyptian glasses before you read this book, because otherwise you're not going to understand, you're not going to be able to read between the lines, as it were. And that opened up an entire world of critics or of other people who say, this is Baba Mises. I mean, this was written by D, by P, by F, different times, different periods, re-edited, redacted. This isn't, it's a nice book, but it's not a historical book.
Right.
I don't know if this is a fair question. Like, how are we supposed to deal with this over all these years?
Right. So as I mentioned before, I'm riding on the shoulders of Maimonides on this one, who didn't bat an eyelash about saying this, that there are aspects of the Torah that have been hidden to us for a long time. Look, according to our tradition, the Torah has 70 faces. Okay, that means that it communicates its ideas in many different ways on many different levels. Okay, this is just one of them. Now, listen, I mean, the phrase that God took us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. You don't know anything about Egypt, you still get the idea, right?
Yeah.
All I've done is to add another layer, another dimension, another hue, another color. Okay. But I think that now, today, thank God, I would say, that we have so much more knowledge than the Rambam had, Maimonides, and that doing this work is the holy work of recovering many of these contexts and elements of the text, and sometimes with that produce really remarkable ideas. Look, what you have on the screen right now. Okay, that's very nice. Now we understand. Yamincha Hashem tirat soyev, your right hand shatters the enemy, and we understand that this is an appropriation of an Egyptian trope. That's nice, okay, but that's small. Okay, let me show you, Eve, something big. Okay,
please.
All right, this is just here. This is a drawing. This is what it looks like when you're outside. Obviously, all these monuments, etc., and temples, they're blocks. And so stuff is engraved, but you can see the same thing here, right? The right hand, and it's shattering the enemies. This is all over the place. Okay, now look carefully at this picture. Okay, let me narrate what's going on here. Okay, so you see you have 2 figures, a man and a woman. Okay, and it's a rather intimate picture. That is, the man has his hand around her waist, and she has her hand over here around his shoulder. And I mean, if we looked at the next shot, they're looking at each other. And if we had the next shot, we can imagine what they would be doing, right? Okay, now what is going on here? This is the pharaoh. Okay, many pharaohs. This picture is all over the place, and this is a goddess. Okay, this is a goddess, and they're like, you can see they're like about to kiss practically. They are literally gazing at each other. Okay. The idea in Egyptian terms is that the pharaoh is chosen by the gods, loved by the god, and almost an equal because he is fulfilling on earth what the god wants. Okay. And so a kind of a sign of his election, of his status, and of his closeness to God is the idea that he looks at the God and the God looks at him eye to eye. Okay. Now we have the depiction in Deuteronomy in Sefer Dvarim at Mount Sinai, and Moses says, at Mount Sinai, you looked at God panim el panim, face to face. Okay. Now, that's kind of interesting because generally throughout Tanakh, we say, Lo yir'ani ha'adam v'chai. We're not able to see God and survive. He's not visible. If we see him, we'll be blinded. And so the phrase, the trope, panim el panim, that we looked at God face to face, maybe like the Pharaoh and the goddess here, is striking. So first thing is now we can understand face to face is intimacy, but it's election. Just like the Pharaoh is elected by the goddess, Am Yisrael, the children of Israel, are elected by God. But now here's the big takeaway. Okay, what is happening here in this carving, in this inscription, is a sign of the intimacy between a goddess and a king. And what the Torah does is to take that type of notion of intimacy with the God, and it applies it now not to the king of Am Yisrael, to Moshe Rabbeinu, or to some later king, but to the entire people.
Right.
The entire people are elevated to the level which in their host culture in Egypt was only attained by a king. And this is part of a larger enterprise the Torah has to elevate the status of the common man, to be like a king. And it comes through in a whole bunch of things. The fact that Am Yisrael are called children to God. In ancient Near Eastern sources, the children to gods are only the kings. We make a treaty with God at Sinai. In the ancient world, treaties were between kings.
Right.
And so there's several things that this fits in with, but all of this demonstrates an attempt to treat every member of Am Yisrael as a king. And so when we all look at Hashem panim el panim, it's a big raise in the status of the common person. So here's an example, unlike here or here, where okay, now I understand a little bit of the tefillah of our prayers. I understand another half a verse in the book of Exodus. Here we come away with, wow, this was like really beyond its time that the common person in society had high status. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, just thinking about it like from a social perspective, right? If in the ancient world, and even in some countries, I would say today, you have the caste system, you have hierarchies,
Right.
you can't, you're born into one, and that's where you're going to be for the rest of your life. I mean, those of us who grew up in the West, I assume most of the viewers are from some kind of Western country. You work hard enough, you get enough of an education, you can move from wherever you were born into a different kind of a status. But in the ancient world, you were locked in. So I can see this, if you'll excuse the expression, being a very seductive message for people.
Yeah.
Especially people who were slaves.
Right. I have a whole book about this. It's called Created Equal: How the Bible Broke with Ancient Political Thought. And this is the underlying message of the book, that throughout the ancient world, one thing was known for sure: men are not created equal. Everywhere in the ancient world, there was caste and hierarchy and stratification. And only if you knew your place in society and everyone knew their place, boom, 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 only then would things work. Otherwise, there would just be anarchy. It's not that they weren't creative enough to think of equality. They thought that would be anarchy. And what you have in the Torah is the first attempt to take power away from kings and from priests, because in the Torah, kings and priests have far less power than anywhere else in the ancient Near East, and to give far more attention to the common people.
And it's also highlighted in the Torah when they mess up. I mean, there's no, if anything, the wars that we win are not so much recorded as the ones that we've lost.
Right.
Astonishing.
Right.
To really humanize even leaders.
And the stories of the Torah are about the common people mostly. You don't have that anywhere else in the ancient Near East. All the stories are only about kings and only about their victories and the temples they built. There's never stories about the people. Never. Who cares? They don't have any status.
So, I mean, hearing you speak about the Bible is really, and I don't know if the viewers are feeling the same thing. This isn't, and I'm not minimizing it in any way, shape, or form, not just a religious book, which for many people it is. Jews pull it out on Shabbat and we read the portion of the week and we study the Torah. But this is actually a world-changing book.
Yes, there is. Look, there have been a lot of great political thinkers over the course of time, over the course of history. And maybe each thinker had their own little chidush, their own little point that they moved thought a little bit forward. But nothing is as really revolutionary and totally diametrically opposed to everything around it as much as the Torah. And it revolutionizes things in the realm of politics, in the realm of economy, in the realm of theology. Look, just one of the big ideas of the Exodus, which we don't think about, but it's a big part of it, is that the Exodus is an equalizing event. We all came out slaves. Nobody amongst the Jewish people can schwitz and show off and say, well, I'm descended from so-and-so. We were all slaves, and we were all there at Sinai, and that makes all of us equal. Yeah, some of us get richer, that's true, but no one can say, as is so often done, oh, you're from the aristocracy, you're a lord, you're a sir, you're a king. We don't have any of that. We don't have any of that.
Wow, but then that's before the Greeks came up with democracy, way before.
Yes, long before, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And when they came up with democracy, Eve, they were talking about the top 10% of the population.
Yeah, which most people don't realize.
Right.
It wasn't
That's
like
right.
we think of today,
That's right.
one vote for
That's
every
right.
person.
That's right.
Wow.
That's right.
What else can you share? Do you have anything else without giving away too much of?
I think let me see.
What's going to be?
I think that was this was most of it.
Amazing.
Yeah, you know what? Yeah, there was one second. Okay, here. Right.
Oh,
so this we're going to go to at night. The Luxor Temple is just astonishing, beautiful at night. And we're going to be doing this. This is at the Aswan Dam. That temple. This is where some of those images that I showed before were. Let me just, you can see here the map. The map is important. It's important to understand the map of Egypt a little bit. Right. So here we are in Eretz Yisrael. We're over here. Okay.
Right.
On the trip, we're going to be in three areas primarily. Here is Cairo, and Cairo is pretty much where the pyramids are. Let me just say, and everyone should hold their seats. Okay. The Jews didn't build the pyramids. Sorry. No. And the Torah doesn't say that we built the pyramids either. The pyramids are prior to the time of the Torah. And when you think of it, what the Torah says is that the Jews built arei miskanot. They built storehouses. And we are actually going to see storehouses made out of mud brick with straw in it from that time. Time. So you have here the pyramids, they're here. And we're going to be seeing, obviously, the Cairo Geniza from a much later period. The best stuff, most of the stuff I was showing you is from here, from a place called Luxor, which is 600 miles south or so of from Cairo. And this is where all the great temples and the great monuments are. And then finally down here, near the border with Sudan, is well, for us as Jews, what's so important is that there's a little island in the middle of the Nile called Elephantine. Now, many of our viewers might not be familiar with this. Let me tell you why this is just such an important area and what they found there. So there's a fortress there from, I think, the 5th century or so BCE. And they found there the writings of a huge Jewish colony in this fortress, all the way down here on the Sudanese border. Well, what are Jews doing down here on the Sudanese border? Well, we know the book of Jeremiah tells us that after the destruction of Jerusalem, Jews didn't know where to go or what to do. Should they stay, be under the Babylonians?
The first temple, right.
Yeah, the first temple. Everything's destroyed. And a whole bunch of them had the idea, much like my grandparents and your grandparents, Eve, in Russia or wherever, in the Pale, who said, where we are now is terrible. Conditions here are terrible. We want to go to a place that is prosperous. We want to go to a place that is known for its safety. So we'll go to North America. If you're living in the land of Israel right after the destruction of the first temple, then that parallel is Egypt. Egypt is prosperous. Egypt has no enemies because there's deserts all around. And so they all flocked to Egypt, including Jeremiah himself. And apparently some of the Jews, Jews spread out just like they did in America. They didn't all stay in New York. And some Jews wound up at this very southern point in the Nile at Elephantine. And what's so significant is that we get a very rich picture of what diaspora life. This is the oldest diaspora community that we know about. It's from the 5th century BCE. And we get a picture of what diaspora life was like for these Jews. Like I'll just give, they describe their observance of Passover in great detail. Yeah. They built a temple right there on the Sudanese border. They built a temple. And we can say, oh my gosh, that's forbidden. You can only build the temple in Jerusalem. That's how our sages have understood it. But we can understand very well, based on the Bible, why they would have built a temple. Ezekiel says and Ezekiel's living obviously in Babylon,
Right.
and he says to the people there, he says, God says, I will be for you mikdash me'at, a small mikdash, literally temple. The rabbis understood that as a source for synagogues. How do we know we can build a synagogue? Maybe we can't build anything. The rabbis understood that Ezekiel was talking about synagogues, but you can easily understand how someone reading that passage where a prophet says, even when you go into the exile, I will be for you a small temple. Well, they built themselves a small temple.
I'm particularly excited about that because I took a course this year with Professor S.D. Eshel, and we learned about the things that were found there, like a marriage a divorce contract and papers of ownership with Hebrew names in them, which are also very interesting because one is about a woman who owned property. We're talking about quite a few years ago, and also initiated the divorce, which in some ways was easier than the halachot that we have today. So it's just this unbelievable glimpse of the transition of Judaism. Like, it's so unique. It was just it was wild.
And everything there is so perfectly preserved because it is incredibly barren and dry.
Wow.
Incredibly, just like you can see in that top photo. It looks like the area around Eilat, bone dry, 365 days a year, no humidity.
Do we have any idea where Goshen was, or we talk about
Sure, sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Where might that be?
So Goshen, so here's Cairo, and this green area is what we call the Nile Delta. This is where the Nile splits off into a whole bunch of tributaries, and therefore this area is very fertile. Okay, Goshen is somewhere in here. In fact, the names that the Torah gives in Exodus in 12, 13, and 14, Piachirot, Migdol, Etam, these are all areas that we now know where they are. And so it would appear that Kriyat Yam Suf, the crossing of the sea, was not here, the Red Sea, and probably not even here in the Gulf of Suez. It might have been what we call the Great Bitter Lakes, might have been here, not clear. Somewhere around here. This is because this is a more fertile area and more moisture, there's nothing left from that period. In fact, a lot of it is now underwater. What we know, that back then would have been apparently climate change. It has been going on for a long time, long before carbon emissions. But we're not going to talk about that. So there's nothing really to see, but we have a kind of a general sense of where the area of Goshen was, and it was probably up here.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, do we know? Because assuming that we were already doing things differently. For example, the Egyptians worshipped cows, yes? Or no? Like, how does that hold the golden calf? Yeah.
I guess
that's
so.
another interesting.
Names are fascinating names, for example, Hur in the book of Exodus, who kind of helped out Aaron when Moses went up to the mountain. Right. Hur in Egyptian is Horus, okay? The god Horus. In other words, they definitely used some of these names, just like we have Esther and Mordechai,
Right.
And a lot of the names in Exodus, are Egyptian. I was talking to a friend of mine named Pinchas about this stuff, and I said to him, Pinchas, I hate to break it to you, you don't have a Jewish name. He was like, and I said, come on, what could be more of a Jewish name than Pinchas?
Right.
No, it's Egyptian. Think about it. There's no root. There's no Hebrew root. It's not like, I don't know, my name Yehoshua. Shua, that's redemption with
or the theophoric names that have
exactly.
El or Yah.
Pinchas, right. You can't even find that there's too many letters in there to be a root. It's Egyptian. It means the Nubian. We have Egyptian inscriptions that have the name Pinchas.
Okay, but now it's the Jewish name. Now it's appropriate. Like Moshe also.
Maybe.
Right? Is that Egyptian? Maybe we don't know.
Well, there's less certainty about that one. Less certainty.
Wow. So, do you have any? Maybe this is really not a fair question. Do you have any doubt that this story happened?
No.
As written? No,
Listen, when you say as written, Eve, so there's a lot of details there,
you're right.
whether all the people listed, one has to address miracles, I don't have any evidence for the miracles themselves, but the idea that Am Yisrael were oppressed in Egypt at the times of Ramses II, and that something happened to them that they ascribed to a Kadosh Baruch Hu, to the Almighty, and used endless elements of pharaonic propaganda from that time and turned it on them. Something went on there. Something went on there that they felt compelled to perpetuate, and which has left the greatest impact on Jewish literature, on biblical literature. That to me says there's something went on there, and I feel very comfortable.
Well, we have a holiday, like you mentioned, the Passover Seder. I mean, we have an evening once a year, which even Jews who are not affiliated really very much with Judaism, and quite a few Christians that I know as well these days gather together and talk about this, getting out of Egypt, and like something big happened that imprinted itself on a whole lot of people a long time ago that we're still remembering.
Yep.
Well, if I wasn't excited before, now I'm super excited to go down
Excellent.
there. I hope it all works out. Like, what could go wrong these days, right? What could change the plans in this very calm world that we live in? Anybody, if you have any questions now for Rabbi Dr. Berman, you could put it up on the chat. Let me just see, because some people.
Yeah, I'll just say, I don't know how much this came through. So Eve is joining me on a tour in January to Egypt. It'll be the first tour ever that is to Egypt that is kosher, and especially, I think maybe bunches of years ago there might have been kosher tours, but this will be the first tour that goes with a Tanakh in hand to go from site to site, from monument to monument, and say, here, see this picture, this inscription, this helps us understand this in Tanakh and this in Tanakh, just like we've done here on this podcast today. And it's being organized by Kesher Tours. It's sold out, but please God, virus is allowing and politics allowing, maybe.
And weather also, you said Egypt, you can't go any time of year.
You can only go in the winter. And even in the winter, it's quite warm. Yeah.
Well, I mean, for me, it's the ultimate field trip, and I just like super excited. I've been actually wanted to go for a while, and I would have managed with the food, so I'd bring tuna and crackers from Israel. I didn't need, but Shabbat was always the issue for me. I don't travel on Shabbat, and the group's going to go somewhere and leave me, and it wasn't going to work. So I was just super excited, and I really hope that our trip goes well and safely, obviously, and that you can do this, every year or whatever it is, and really open people's eyes to an aspect of our history in Egypt and of Egyptian history that wouldn't be able to do without Tanakh in hand. Somebody asked here, if you know somebody, let me see what they said. If you know, it's
Jewish geography.
No, actually not a Jewish name. How come I can't open here and see? Is Rabbi Dr. Berman familiar with Dr. Zahi Hawass? Name sound familiar?
If I'm not mistaken, he is like the chief archaeologist of Egypt or something like that. I don't know him. No.
Okay.
I think he's more of a political figure, to be honest. But
yeah, I think I've read about him as well. And someone else had a question. Can you comment on David Roll's book, Exodus, Myth or History, where he argues the timeline? Are you familiar?
I'm not familiar with that work. Nope.
Okay. All right. David Goldfarb, good question. All right. Send, because I mean, it's clear that the whole timeline is a major issue in history in general, but definitely when it comes to the Bible. And let's see if anybody else had anything before we let you go. There is a theory that the Egyptian Jews originated from the Jews of Elephantine. A European educated Ethiopian Jewish leader, Yonah Bogale, was of this opinion. There is much that fits in terms of practices, as it believed they traveled along the Nile. That sound like something, maybe?
But look, I mean, the book of Exodus, there's too much in the Torah that fits periods that are before. There are things that are in the book of Exodus that you could only, the things I like best when we're talking about dating the Torah are things that you could only know if you were alive back at a certain time. Okay, so for example, there are a whole bunch of what we call loan words. Those are words that you and I, Eve, would identify as Hebrew words, but they are in fact taken from the Egyptian language, like the word teva. okay, like the basket that Moses was put in,
Right,
or the ark
right.
that Noah built is also called teva.
Teva.
Now, teva is an Egyptian word, it turns out, okay? Now, there's a
Mhm.
whole bunch of Egyptian words, and what's so fascinating in terms of dating is that the way in which they're spelled in the Torah mandates that they must have come into the Hebrew language in the 13th century BCE, because at
Really?
later dates, a teva, box, let's call it, okay, or basket, was no
Mhm.
longer called teva, it was called tevi, okay? So if the Torah is calling it teva, that's the way in which Egyptians pronounced it in the earlier period. There's a whole bunch
Hmm.
of things that are like that. Okay.
Hmm.
So that's why it's hard for me, that together with many other things that tie the accounts of the book of Exodus to the 13th century BCE, make it difficult for me to accept that Jews started in Elephantine. How did they get there? I might ask that opinion, okay? And that the Jews
Right.
come from there, you know. I mean, especially when
No,
their own
the question was specifically Ethiopian Jews. So where there's some tradition that they're from the tribe of Dan. When there was the exile, they went down there. There's other traditions that they come from the child of Queen of Sheba and King
I
Solomon.
see.
There's
Oh,
a
I see. So
lot
yeah.
of
So
interesting history having to do with
look, you know,
Ethiopia.
maybe. I mean, but look, I mean, what's clear, we know for sure from the book of Jeremiah, 6th century, that
Yeah.
Jews went to Egypt. Okay, so if we find Jews in Elephantine a century later, why should we think that it's anything other than those same Jews? Especially when they're talking about things like a Passover and stuff. It looks like they're taking traditions that were clearly, you know, in circulation in the land of Israel around the time of the destruction.
Doesn't the Bible tell us not to go back to Egypt, though? I'm not canceling my
Uh,
reservation. I'm just
I
throwing that out
understand.
there.
I think that's like to purchase horses and things like that. So we'll stay away
Uh-huh.
from horses.
We'll
Yeah,
stay away from horses.
I think so. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. All right. Amazing. Thank you so
Good.
much.
All right, Eve. Thank you so much, and to
Really
all the
enjoyed this.
viewers
I'm
who
sure my
stayed
viewers did
on.
as well. And
Okay.
anybody, if you were watching this and there was someone who wanted to watch it, but was maybe working at 1 o'clock in the afternoon on a Monday, this will be sent out at One Israel Fund. If you're on our email list, you will be getting a copy of this. It'll also be on the website, along with the other webinars that we have taped during the course of this year, and the virtual tours, and the projects that we're running, and any news that we want to share. Really, I'm really glad that Rabbi Dr. Joshua Berman joined us this evening, and just to illuminate for us the magnificent history of this area and of our people's journey. And this is way back. This is like the first journey, or one of the first journeys, and with a lot of question marks, and so many things have been written about it by just brilliant people over the ages. And so thank you for really illuminating some of that and some of the connections with the Tanakh that I didn't know, and I'm sure that most of my viewers didn't know as well. So, and here, some of the people viewing, fascinating. Thank you. Really a lot of appreciation. And if you want to continue, obviously, everybody, get Ani Ma'amin. You can follow some of his mind and his thinking, even from the comfort of your lazy boy in your living room. So thank you again. And thank you everyone for tuning in. We're going to be back next month, I hope, with another, I keep digging up amazing people. It's really an honor to be able to do this. So thank you everyone. And thanks to the office, of course, One Israel Fund, for providing the platform for this and making it free so that everybody can enjoy some of the really the tremendous people that we have doing a lot of thinking, even about things that you think like, what more could you say? And you come up with what more can you say and what more can you learn? So take care, everyone. Eve Harow, Director of Community Development and Tourism. Can't wait to get back to the tourism part for One Israel Fund. And we will be back, and just be well. Thank you.
Thank you.